when they're at this stage where they're what's called replicating, multiplying into multiple viruses here, the nucleic acid, be it DNA or RNA, is being copied over and over and over again. Now, in RNA viruses, remember, it's a single strand, it's unstable. And so in viruses that use RNA, whenever it gets copied like this, the chances of it mutating, making a mistake, is much, much higher. And so RNA viruses actually have a higher chance of having very tiny mutations. Now, before people start thinking, oh my gosh, these mutations are terrible and they're going to kill humankind, keep in mind, it's kind of like if I had an essay, a mutation is like changing one letter out of that entire essay, okay? If you copy it enough times, yes, you are probably going to change meanings of certain words. Is there a huge, huge point in that? Not really. But understand too, though, you know, if we look at statistics, one cell makes thousands, it could make hundreds to thousands of viruses depending on what it is. So there's that too. So, you know, come to your own conclusions about that in some ways. DNA viruses, because they are so stable, they do have less mutations than RNA viruses do. Let's see. Did I miss any questions? I know there's some discussion here, so I'm not going to go over that. But did I miss any questions while I was talking? Yes, no? Or can I go on? Okay, I'm going to go on. All right. Okay, viruses in history. A couple weeks ago, I talked about Ebola. So a quick update on Ebola, because that's always on people's minds, is, and the reason why I bring up Ebola too is because I want to compare it with some of the other pandemics that have been around, just to give you some perspective, and I just thought this was incredibly interesting. Ebola, up to date, on November 14th, okay, World Health Organization reported 14,413 cases, 5,177 deaths. Keep that in mind, okay, because a lot of people freak out about Ebola, but yet they don't freak out about flu. Okay, HIV/AIDS, just to give you a comparison, right? Right now, currently, there are about estimated 35 million people infected with HIV or have AIDS, and have AIDS. 3.2 million are under the age of 15. So, you know, people freak out about Ebola, I know, but at the same time, we got to compare numbers, right? 35 million compared to 14,413 for Ebola. Since 1981, and these are statistics from 2013, so subtract the 35 million people that are infected, 39 million people have died from it. Now, 71% of all AIDS cases are actually in sub-Saharan Africa. So you don't see them here. So when we say there is an AIDS epidemic, it's actually not in the United States, it's in Africa. But there are a lot of people that die from it. So, okay, that's one current pandemic, I would argue. You know, 35 million people is quite a bit. Now, Spanish flu. So I know when I talk about viruses and when I talked about Ebola, I'm always talking about flu because to me, flu scares me more than Ebola does, a lot more when it comes to potential pandemics. Why? 1918, in 1 year, across the world, 50 million people died. Okay, in 1 year. Now compare that to HIV/AIDS, where 39 million people died since 1981. And let's look at Spanish flu that killed 50 in 1 year. So this is a scary thing, okay? And especially because flu is highly contagious. Flu itself is airborne, right? And it stays on surfaces for a very long time. And I'm going to ask this question at the very end too, is if we were to have an outbreak of a very deadly flu, and remember swine flu, right? Just a couple years ago. Who gets quarantined? How do we contain that? It's a far deadlier disease, I would argue, in some cases, because it's far more contagious than Ebola. Okay? Now, before even that, we can talk about smallpox. And smallpox, from the many different sources, and by the way, I almost forgot to tell you, and I apologize for that, is you'll notice on all my slides, I actually have numbers on the top. You see these subscripted numbers. Those of you that have been to my talks, you probably know about these, but those of you that have not, I really apologize for not bringing this up. There is an information prim that is right above the slides, and that has all of my references, and I strongly suggest actually taking a look at them. These numbers correspond to those references so that you can actually take a look and read more about some of the things that I'm talking about. But take a look at those references too, because they have interesting information. Smallpox, it's an estimated in only the 20th century. Now keep in mind that smallpox has been around for a very long time. In fact, it almost goes hand in hand with history, right? But 300 million people have died in only the 20th century. 100 years. Smallpox was terrible. It was a terrible, terrible scourge. It's been around for nearly 3,000 years. We don't even know, right, from here, 3,000 years, how many people have died from it. But what's interesting is thanks to vaccination, the World Health Organization declared smallpox the world to be free of smallpox since 1980. Meaning there are no more smallpox cases because we vaccinated so effectively. So that to me is like a big wow, right? Like that, if you read about the history of smallpox, and the fact that, people really made a global effort to eliminate this disease, this very, very awful disease from our planet, it's kind of an amazing thing, I think. Are there any questions about viruses in history that I can answer for you? And actually, I have a slide of them. My next slide is about pictures of what they look like as viruses. Let's see. Truth asks, it is making a big comeback in Pakistan because the CIA used phony vaccinations to spy. I don't know if it's making a comeback. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, as far as I understand, there are no cases of smallpox there is no one infected with smallpox right now in the world. There are third world countries that continue to vaccinate for it because they want to make sure it stays that way. But my understanding is there are only 2 places where smallpox, the living virus itself, I shouldn't say living, but they do call it that way, live virus itself is, and that's in Russia and in the United States. Deep in, I want to say CDC, but don't quote me on that because I actually did not look that up. I'm just going back from memory. CDC? Yes, my husband says CDC. So there's only 2 repositories that we know of smallpox itself. Oh, okay, so truth, you're talking about polio. Okay, polio, yes. Go ahead, Vadi, please ask. About an earlier slide. Let me know which slide it is and I can flip back to it for you. This one, virus is taking over cells. Okay. When a gene is mutated, okay, I see your question, Madison, and I will answer that in a second. Let me have Vadi complete his. Is it because a protein comes close to it and sticks, thus changing its code? No. Actually, the genes is the DNA, which is the instructions, and then from the instructions you then create the protein. So it's almost like, you have a recipe, which is the DNA, and then the bread that you make from that recipe is the proteins. Okay? So a little bit different, and I know I've covered a lot, so I can imagine the confusion there. So a mutation and a change in the protein, a mutation itself usually is a genetic mutation. That's almost like, I would say, you have a recipe and you swap out an ingredient. That would be, a change, like a written saying, instead of, sugar, I'm going to put honey. That would be a change. What ends up happening is then when you read it and you put together the amino acids slightly change because of that instruction. And then because the amino acids change, the protein then mutates as well. And yes, Madison is right. Mutations may or may not change the protein. How do mutations occur? Sometimes they are spontaneous, meaning when a cell is copied over and over and over again, the enzyme may not correctly read it, and that may change. Other mutations happen, for instance, cancer. When you're exposed to the sun, UV light will change nucleic acids too. So those are like two very main ways that you can actually have mutations in the, yes, and Madison is right, that's a huge topic on the various ways. You can actually have mutations in the code itself. And then let me see, I'm going back here. How does smallpox kill? Smallpox, if you think about chickenpox, that's like 10 times worse. And I'm saying this realizing that there is an entire generation that has never had chickenpox. So tell me if that was confusing to anybody and I'll clarify. But you basically have a bunch of just swollen, itchy little pustules all over your body. And it just, I guess it gets to the point where your body can no longer maintain that, and you die from fevers and all kinds of things. So it's pretty bad. Are there other questions that I can answer for you? And I'm apologize if I missed your question. It's because there's a lot of discussion going on in local chat too. So let me know if there is a question that I can answer for you. Oh, why is DNA less stable? Okay. More prone to mutations. Let me show you real quick. I'm going to go back to that slide, which is now slightly blurry. Okay, so do you see in this, I'm going to click down local chat, everybody, so forgive me if I miss your question. Ask it again when I'm done explaining here. Do you see DNA versus RNA here? DNA has 2 strands, okay, and it has these nucleic acids that run across, and it's almost like saying here, it's more stable because of the structure. So a ladder is more stable when it has 2 sides to it than half a ladder, wouldn't you agree? So in some cases, in this case, it's kind of the same thing, and I am very much simplifying things here. RNA is almost just saying there's half of a ladder. And so in that case, it's just a less stable molecule itself. But if we want to get into the technicalities of why there's more mutations in RNA in some cases, it's because DNA is, I would say, the original code. RNA is like a copy of that code. So a lot of times, DNA is the original. RNA, you make multiple copies of the original. Okay? When you make more copies of RNA, you have a tendency to have more mutations simply because you're making far more copies of it than the DNA, which tends to be just the original template. So let me put it this way, in a nutshell, there's many different ways and reasons why that there's mutations, and I noticed that Madison is explaining, which I really appreciate. But one of the reasons, one big reason why DNA is less prone to mutation than RNA is because of its shape, its structure, the fact that it is twice, I would argue, as big as RNA, and so it's a little more stable. And as Madison says, so if one side is damaged, you can use the other side to repair. Thank you so much for filling in for me there. I appreciate it. Other questions that I can answer before I go on? I don't even know what RAID drives are, Gandalf, so I probably, you'd have to tell me what RAID drives are before I'd know if it's the same or not, but maybe that's a discussion for another time. Okay, I'm going to go on. And thank you, Madison, so much. If you take a look here, I just for kicks and jollies put up, these viruses that are responsible for a lot of these pandemics. And you can see influenza, and the reason why I did that really is so that you can see the different varieties and shape. In some ways, which is kind of unfortunate, but not. Influenza, HIV, and smallpox kind of have that similar circular shape. Ebola, though, and if you went to the talk that I did before, looks very, very different. Ebola, incidentally, is an RNA virus, too. And I will be honest with you, I do not remember whether or not influenza and smallpox are. I didn't look it up, so it's not fresh in my memory. But HIV, too, is also an RNA virus. Just an FYI there. Okay? All right. Okay. I'm going to talk about bacteria. So before I talk about bacteria, any quick questions before I go on? No? All right. Thank you, everybody, so much. I know I'm giving you a lot of information, so I hope it's not too much of an overload. Okay. E. coli is next. Yes, E. coli is next. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about bacteria. All right. First, I'm going to just go to the basics. Remember, we talked about bacteria are alive. So one of the biggest differences between bacteria and viruses, just from a very random definition, is living things are made of cells and non-living things are not. Well, bacteria are made of cells. They are alive based on that cell definition. Okay. Now, the distinction, though, and I want to bring this up here, is you remember we talked about the difference between DNA and RNA and why it's really important? Well, there is a distinction between what's called a eukaryote and a prokaryote. Bacteria and us and all living things are made of cells. Okay? All animals are made out of cells, but they're made out of these particular cells called eukaryotic cells. We are eukaryotes. Bacteria are what's called prokaryotes, okay? And their cells, there's a ton of different differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. I'm not going into a whole lot of detail, except that prokaryotic cells are really, really tiny. They don't have what's called organelles, and if you don't know what organelles are, don't worry about it. But in other words, eukaryotic cells are far, far, far more complex than prokaryotic cells. One way that I explain it is a eukaryotic cell is like a condominium. It's a really complicated building. A prokaryotic cell is like a tent. Okay? They're both cells, they're both sorts of structures, but in terms of complexity, completely, completely different. But prokaryotic cells, their DNA, and they have DNA, okay, is free-floating, whereas ours is packed into this little structure called a nucleus, and people have probably heard of nuclei, so I'm not going to go into that in much detail. But yes, eukaryotic cells have nuclei. Prokaryotic cells have this free-floating DNA in their cells. Now, the other thing that you want to see, and I'm going to just turn your attention to this slide here, this picture at the bottom. Eukaryotic cells are way bigger than prokaryotic cells. See the prokaryotic cell? It's really, 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 really tiny compared to a eukaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells also carry something that animals don't, but plants do, which is cell walls. Okay, and a cell wall is basically you've got your little tender cell membrane, which kind of holds everything in. Both eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells have that, but prokaryotic cells have an additional structure on the outside, which is a cell wall, and it is what it sounds like. It's like a wall around the cell. It's made of different things, though. It's the cell wall that tends to be the reason why we get sick, incidentally. in addition to other things. But the cell wall is the reason why we get fevers. So, going on. Stephen actually brought this up, and I'm going to just mention this really briefly because it's extremely interesting. Mitochondria is like an organelle. It's found actually in our eukaryotic cells, okay? And I'm showing this because there's a relative size. So you guys see these little green things are the mitochondria in our cells. Mitochondria are unique. They are, we call them, typical high school biology, you call them the powerhouse of the cell because these are like our little power factories. They make the energy that our cells need to do the stuff that they need to do. What's interesting is if we compare mitochondria with our own cells, they have separate DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is very different than our DNA, like our nuclear DNA, I should say. The other interesting thing about mitochondria, just some fast facts, right, is that mitochondria, the DNA in mitochondria does not recombine. In other words, you know how like we have DNA from mom and dad? So we're a mix, right? We're half mom. We have DNA half from mom and half from dad. Our nuclear DNA has this. Mitochondrial cells come from mom, only from mom. So you can actually trace your maternal line through your mitochondria. But the other thing, and the reason why I bring this up, and the reason why Stephen said, Blue, you got to bring this up, is because way back when, it was believed that mitochondria were actually bacteria. Not only that, they were bacteria that our eukaryotic cells ate. But instead of, eating them and crunching them up and destroying them, they decided to create a symbiotic relationship, meaning, hey, these mitochondria are actually very helpful to us. They can give us energy. And in the meantime, we protect them and do all kinds of other stuff. So, why I wanted to also bring this up then is that, pathogens have been with us for a very long time throughout our evolution. And Stephen is actually going to talk about the intimate relationship. This is next week, so it's a plug for next week. The intimate relationship between microbes and man, and how that happens. So that's my little plug there for cells and mitochondria. Yeah, free advertising. Even though we're like doing similar talks. So yes, next week Stephen will actually have a really interesting talk about microbes that don't kill you. I find the microbes that do are more interesting in some ways, but they're actually, I shouldn't say more interesting. This is what I know. I don't know that much about beneficial bacteria, to be honest with you. Okay, questions that I can answer so far before I go to, the stuff that does kill you. Yes? No? All right, I'm going to go on. E. coli. Okay, so good and bad bacteria. Again, this is a little bit of a plug for Stephen's stuff too, is we have to have bacteria in order to live. Our guts are full of bacteria, mostly E. coli, although there's a bunch of other beneficial bacteria in our guts too. We have to have them. Now, yeah, and Rune, you're right. And I better click down the IMs before I end up getting into discussions and forgetting to do this lecture. Okay, so one of the things, so we've got good bacteria like E. coli, right? But you guys have probably heard of E. coli that's bad for you. It's this stuff called enterohemorrhagic E. coli, EHEC. I know it also as E0157H7. My master's study was actually, I did a project on EHEC because it was just so fascinating to me. So my master's is in pathogenic bacteriology, although the irony is that I did my project, my final thesis on rotavirus. Anyways, going back to E. coli. Why is it that EHEC can kill you, but yet the E. coli in your gut can't, or doesn't, or normally doesn't? And the reason why is because there's these things called virulence factors. A virulence factor is basically genes that these bacteria have that make proteins that make the bacteria pathogenic. So in this case, for E. coli, EHEC has a different genetic makeup. It has genes that are different from the E. coli that are actually in your gut. So, enterohemorrhagic E. coli has these virulence factors that make it very, very toxic. They're genes that create what's called virotoxins, okay? And the virotoxins, when they multiply in your body, can go into your bloodstream and cause, in about 10% of those infected, this case of what's called hemolytic uremic syndrome, HUS, which results in kidney failure. So people actually don't die from EHEC infections themselves. They actually die when their organs start to fail. Their blood pressure then drops, and yeah, it's not pretty. So this is actually the reason why EHEC is so bad. Now, there's actually many different kinds of E. coli that are pathogenic to you. There's travelers E. coli, and there's some other things. But it all has to do with these virulence factors that make these bacteria just so bad. So questions about virulence factors at all? No? Okay, I'm going to keep going. All right, so you're probably wondering, okay, well, we talked about viruses and what kinds of viruses have been, known in history. The one that you've probably all heard about is bubonic plague. So smallpox is a virus. Bubonic plague is caused by a bacterium. So this bacterium has plagued us since 224 BC. Like a really long time it's been with us. It is carried usually by rodents, okay, and passed by lice. It's a bacterium. The lice bite us, infected lice bite us, and then it passes the bacteria to us. Now, what's interesting about this is that even now, the United States actually has bubonic plague. It is endemic, which means it is, in fact, what's interesting is these pathogenic bacteria that infect us, like, for instance, Salmonella, is what's called endemic or a natural bacterium in other organisms. Like I said, Salmonella is one of them. Chickens have Salmonella. They are fine with Salmonella. They're happy with Salmonella. But when we eat the chicken and we get Salmonella, not so pretty. But bubonic plague is actually in the United States naturally, and about 1 to 17 cases are reported annually in the United States. But fortunately, unlike viruses where there's very few cures, there's no cure for a virus. You just have to let your immune system catch up. Bubonic plague you can cure with antibiotics. Thank goodness for antibiotics, right? So in the 14th century, it was huge. It killed approximately 25 million people between 1347 and 1352. It has killed, and it's hit Europe a lot throughout time. This was just, what I reported here was just actually the biggest plague, but if you actually Google bubonic plague and you see, it has come back over and over and over again in these populations until antibiotics. So, yay, antibiotics. Okay. The other plagues that you probably haven't heard so much about, especially in developed countries, is cholera. So cholera is caused by Vibrio cholerae, and yes, we do, although I didn't report the numbers here, we do get cases of Vibrio cholera in the United States. It's mostly because people eat raw seafood, which is interesting. It has caused about 7 major pandemics in history. Although what I find really fascinating about it is there is an argument that cholera, there is a pandemic right now in cholera in Haiti. And the reason why is because of the poor sanitary conditions. Cholera is passed through, it's a lovely term, the fecal-oral route. You can imagine what that means. It means one should always wash their hands when they're done using the bathroom, because you get cholera when you ingest fecal material that has been contaminated with cholera. Now, rotaviruses and other viruses actually are passed the same way too. I just forgot to tell you about